The Honourable Bill English has been a Member of Parliament since 1990. He represents a seat in the rural heartland of New Zealand. He's a former leader of the National Party and now Deputy Leader as well as a Finance Minister. He's also a Minister for Infrastructure in the National Government. He served as Minister for Health, Minister of Finance and Minister of Revenue in previous national governments and was Shadow Education spokesperson, so he has very broad background. He has a special interest, I think, in the public service, and I believe once worked in the Treasury Department, although he may be not highlighting that in his CV. He's also kindly contributed to a number of previous conferences, in fact, two, I think, and although I did wonder whether he was using those as a platform to boast a bit about New Zealand's performance in the Bledisloe Cup, and I promised him I wouldn't say anything about the Waratahs win recently or anything about the netball or anything like that. So we're very grateful that, that Bill English has taken time during the election campaign in New Zealand to come here. I suspect that Joe's already taken a fair bit of your material, Bill, but we're very interested to hear what else you have to say. So could you please welcome the Honourable Bill English to the podium, please.
Well, thank you very much, Gary, for your introduction, brief as it should have been, and for your ongoing work between the New Zealand and Australian public services and the enormous benefit that we get out of ANZSOG. I can also acknowledge Canberra for making me feel at home. I'm from the far south of the South Island, and we have a decent winter, and you have a decent winter here too. So after the muggy, slightly Asian feel of Sydney, it's great to get off the plane this morning. And can also acknowledge my good friend Joe. We have known each other for some time. We did decide on names for our children separately. I'm more productive than Joe. I have 6. He has, I think, 3. Sort of the right Kiwi-Aussie ratio. In the long run, we will win. Joe came to New Zealand a couple of weeks ago and helpfully pointed out in front of one very large crowd that we'd had a dinner at a restaurant in Sydney and I had left without paying for it. So he had to pay for it. So the next day in front of a large crowd, I said to Joe, well, here's the free dinner for you. I paid you back. So thank you, Joe, for your very productive and positive visit to New Zealand, because it means you know a bit about the place. Last night I spoke at a function in Sydney, and we had about an hour, I suppose, of me saying a bit and then lots of questions and answers. And at the end of it, a Sydney-sider came up to me and put his hand on my shoulder and said, I really hope things go well in Tasmania. And then went on to discuss his interest in Tas Energy shares. So somewhat confused, and if I fail as badly to get the message across today, like where I'm from, I will blame you, as I blamed him. In the last 10 years, there's been 3 things that have mattered about Australia for New Zealand. One has been big balance sheets. We've had a banking crisis and a large earthquake, and New Zealand has benefited from being part of a larger financial system that's been able to absorb the enormous pressures that have gone with that. As Joe pointed out, the rebuild of Christchurch is costing 20% of GDP. A large amount of that is financed through Australian-owned insurers and, of course, their own reinsurance arrangements. And while it's been a long, difficult process, we've been greatly appreciative of that, the financial strength of those organisations. The second thing that has mattered to us has been the relative success of the Australian economy. We're only growing a bit, starting to grow now, whereas the Australian economy grew right through. Some of you may know Queenstown. Queenstown was saved from quite a severe recession by the Rudd government's $900 cash payments, which many Australians then went and spent on the $899 airfares and they discovered Queenstown. And the other day I opened a $45 million ski field investment and watched hundreds of Australian families who were able to get there when it was cheap 4 or 5 years ago, but still seem willing to come now that the prices are back where they should be. But the other thing we really owe to Australia is that, it's somewhat in contrast to the tone of Joe's speech, we believe we adopted the Australian model of change in the economy. And a conscious decision by the current government, which has now been in power 6 years and may only be in power for another 46 days, to move on from the New Zealand model of change, which was a bit of crash and crash through, to the model that had worked so well for Australia for 30 years, and that was considered and consistent change over time with a broad consensus built up around what those changes should be so that they stuck. And that success of that up until the early part of this decade, or the last decade, has opened up the income gap considerably with Australia. So we thought if we want to close that gap, which we still do, then the Australian model of change might be the way to do it, and that's been the method followed by the current government. However, there have been significant differences. So when we're talking about what contribution government can make to prosperity, we've had quite different circumstances in Australia. The first, and I think the biggest difference, is that in 2008, New Zealand had gone into recession before the global financial crisis. Our export sector had started shrinking 2 or 3 years before the global financial crisis, the result of a build-up of rapid government spending, exploding housing market, and a debt-funded consumption binge on a scale we had never seen before. Private credit in 2007 grew 17%. Fortunately, in retrospect, the global financial crisis brought that to an absolutely unambiguous halt. There was no discussion needed about whether we needed to do some things differently. The second biggest difference is the impact of the Christchurch earthquake, which, if you can imagine this, that every day for a couple of years, New Zealanders saw pictures on their TV of the grief of 180 people who lost their lives, families who lost their lives, a shattered CBD. We've demolished 1,500 buildings in the central business district of Christchurch, and 300,000 houses that needed repaired. So pictures of people sitting in their busted houses with the roof leaking, waiting 2 years to get the repair done and blaming the Australian insurance company. It made my problems look pretty small. So we've had a combination of an unambiguous need for change, and then the Christchurch earthquake providing a deep perspective in which we can put our own smaller issues with public sector reform or what's going on to change our business so it becomes more productive. So New Zealanders have shown fantastic resilience, and I have to say less complaining than I can remember in 25 years of public life. So that has allowed us to run an incremental, progressive, forward-looking program of change, both in the wider business community, microeconomic reform, and in the public sector. And I want to talk a little bit about just where we've gone in the public sector. But first with the business sector, essentially what we've done there to build on this resilience is create a pipeline of microeconomic reform, which we engage closely with business and workplaces, and turning our economy around is a bit like any household or business. You might get a lucky break, you probably won't. You have to do 200 things right, and our policy pipeline of micro reform literally does have 200 or 300 items in it, which we progressively work through to implement. With respect to the public sector, we have taken the view that probably the most direct contribution a government can make to prosperity is to get its own public sector running properly. In New Zealand, it's 27 to 30% of all the cars, people, buildings, IT systems, services. So as well as lecturing everyone else about being more productive, we thought maybe we should have a go. And of course we had something of a compelling reason with a deficit in 1 year of -9% of GDP. And I think when we came in, we recognised the capacity for large gains. Our public sector then had had rivers of cash for 10 years, which meant the senior management was focused on getting into the minister's office to get their share of that cash. The middle management was focused on how to control the spending of more money than they knew what to do with. And the front line felt ignored because the management didn't really know what the entity did. They didn't need to understand the business. So there was relatively low levels by the end of the first decade of the 2000s, relatively low levels of governance and management in our public sector. So we set out with a couple of priorities. One was to protect the most vulnerable. The other, though, was to expect of our public service more for less, as Gary mentioned in his introduction. That is, we took the view that we had the opportunity to continue to improve and provide more public services with less money in a way that aligned our political interests with the interests of the public. Just a couple of, so I've, in that context, focused very much, and the government has, on our larger cost drivers. And I just want to explain that a bit because as a full service government, that is, we're a state and federal government put together, we have a unique opportunity you don't have here in Australia to see the system transparently from the budget and appropriation process right through to service delivery. I can remember a number of years ago in my town of Gore, in my electorate, we launched this trial which was about localising decisions about the spending, government spending on youth in this community. And I walked into this room and it was packed. There must have been, you know, in our small country, 60, 80 people there. It was full of people in this town of 8,000. And I said to them, our problem is that we don't have enough problems. We've got enough people here to individually track each child who's had a disruptive thought 24 hours a day. So it was quite apparent there, as it has been across our public services, resources were not the problem. It was the decisions about how they were used. I can recall another discussion. More recently, we have bad rates of child abuse in New Zealand, and we've targeted those specifically. And so there's a lot of reorganisation going on. And we were sitting in a cabinet committee meeting, I think, and getting this discussion from officials about, you know, the tens of millions we were spending on the relevant professionals talking themselves into agreeing what to do. So this is just not new services, just the transaction costs of talking about what they might do. And someone brought up this issue where essentially the nurses didn't want to be told what to do by the police, and the police didn't want to be told what to do by the nurses. And our welfare minister, who's fantastic, said, okay, why don't they have the meeting outside the home where the child's being beaten up, where they can hear the screams? Maybe then they'll decide. And it was quite an important moment for us because it shifted that kind of thinking, shifted our whole view about what we're trying to achieve to being much more focused on the customer and the result that we want. Public services spend a lot of time not knowing what they're doing. The public think you do know, or at least they think good intentions are enough, but of course good intentions are not enough. We drown in good intentions. That's been the post-war model. We've borrowed hundreds of billions on good intentions across the developed world. So we took the step of publishing results, saying, looking at what were the long-term cost drivers for our fiscal management, which are people, basically. People who commit crimes, beaten up, not educated properly, dysfunctional families. Those are the long-term cost drivers. And we've published these results, which are updated every 6 months. And the critical thing there is not that that's anything new, it isn't. But it's that the politicians put their names to it. So we've actually got a measure, of crime rates, rheumatic fever, third world disease we still have, substantiated physical abuse, educational achievement at your year 11, our year 12, we're a bit slower. And that has allowed us there to demonstrate to the public service what they should be trying to do. And now each one of those results has personal accountability within the public sector. But the way of thinking is changing, and now I think getting some real momentum, but it has taken 6 years. We describe it in pretty simple terms if you compare it to business. A business needs to understand its customers because it grows revenue. We need to understand our customers because they drive cost. And the ideal outcome for us is less customers, not more. And in my more cynical moments, I think that our public services are set up in a very delicate balance of feeding off misery rather than resolving it, rather than attacking our core and complex problems. And just to run you through a few tools we're using for that. Again, nothing new here. We just have a unique opportunity to implement. We're using what we call the investment approach. As a finance minister, I run, and the whole system has run according to this annual cash-driven cycle, which has always seemed, and it's driven by our constitutional requirements. So you've got to keep those in place, of course. But for large, sophisticated organisations trying to sustain effort over decades in order to service our population in quite complex ways, an annual view is quite inappropriate. So first, we've moved them to a 4-year view. So our organisations have to show us how they balance over 4 years, not 1 year. And that gives them the room now to think about the development of their strategic finance capacity, or their people, who they can't go and get a whole lot of different people. You have to work with who you have. The investment approach itself is simply about assessing the cash flows of the costs we face for particular communities and populations, and then deciding what to spend now to reduce that future cash flow. And if I can just give you an example, a sole parent under 20 in New Zealand stays on benefit for 20 years on average. Net present value $250,000. And we've used Taylor Fry, Australian Actuaries, to calculate that for our whole benefit population. The total is 76 billion. So with that group, we've spent 7,000 per year on each one. It's worth us investing in each one, all 2,600 of them. We know their names. They have a supervising adult in their life who keeps the dodgy boyfriend away, tries to deal with the addiction problems, most importantly gets them back into school, because if they get any kind of school, post-school qualification, they're off the benefit in 7 years, not 20. And that saves, across the population, millions. Another group where this is really important are children in care, who generate a vastly disproportionate amount of cost to governments. We know a group, again, a small country or an estate, you can do this, of 2,000 kids where, based on 30 years of records, their future prison costs will be $750 million. And traditionally, we've looked after those kids on a shoestring, as a parent vaguely better than the ones we took them off, but only just. So the question for officials is, what would we do, what can we spend and do now to save $750 million of costs in our prison system? And interestingly, they usually don't know. They usually don't know, because they haven't tried to solve that problem. What we've done is service the care of children system, the children and young persons and their family system, the youth prison system. We've serviced it rather than try and dig in and solve the problems at the root of it. And of course what we find, and I can say this as the finance, even as with my finance hat on, often we're underspending on our long-term fiscal cost drivers. We don't, in New Zealand, spend enough on the kids who are hardest to educate. We don't do some really simple things. Great story came out of the other day, we're running a whole range of experiments around the country they discovered in one city of 50,000 people that there was a comprehensive testing of all our children. In fact, a city with low socioeconomic population, comprehensive testing of their hearing and vision in the health part of the system, but no one gave it to the schools. So we spent 2 years working out at school whether this kid was deaf or not in the school, where in the hospital they already knew. In the primary care service they already knew. So what we're finding as we dig into these long-term cost drivers is that the solutions we need are quite different than the traditional policy analysis delivered by the public sector. Because there's a number of features of this approach that are quite important. The first thing is individualising the policy. In today's relatively low cost of assembling ubiquitous data, you can know each person. And our policy doesn't think like, our policy machine doesn't think like that. It thinks in categories, classes, socioeconomic levels, most of which is actually pretty useless. Most of which is pretty useless for actually resolving your long-term fiscal costs. We tested this the other day. We're changing our budget process so it's driven by families and communities, not government departments. People don't live in government departments. We do, they don't. They live in families and communities. So we've got health, education, welfare and justice to bring along a summary of their analysis about vulnerable children, at-risk children and at-risk youth. And what we saw were 4 quite different, beautifully crafted ways with all their own institutional rich history and culture of analysing exactly the same people. So one uses a deprivation index that goes from 1 to 10, the other one uses one that goes from 10 to 1. Same kids. Massive unnecessary overhead. So now we're just going to agree on how do we define among ourselves the at-risk children who generate very high long-term liabilities, up to $1 million each for about the bottom 0.2%. Let's just agree on that, cut out all the rest of it, and then go and pay individual attention to them. The second thing is that when you start looking at that, looking at it that way, your front line matter a lot more than your management. So the way we are approaching fiscal consolidation, almost without exception, involves much more substantive engagement of frontline public servants, appealing to their intrinsic motivation about what they want to achieve and working to provide them with the decision tools that allow them to be flexible and come up with better solutions. It also means a different relationship with other people who know things. We have a fantastic range of programs for all sorts of people with diabetes, old people, youth, but actually for 20% of the time we just can't find them. Doesn't matter how good the program is, if you can't find the person and they can't or don't access it. So increasingly it's the soft knowledge we need, not more policy analysis that you can print off world's best practice from the OECD website like my 12-year-old did the other day for a school debate. But in this community, who knows how these people live? Why don't we go and see them? Why don't we ask them why it is they're not accessing a service, for instance? This also means a different relationship with a third party and third parties in the private sector, but on the basis of a different relationship with the customer. We're going through a fascinating process now with our private providers and NGOs, where they can see we are now serious about the customer and that our relationship is fundamentally with our customer and the third sector is there to help with that. A fundamental relationship is not with the third sector, and they need to be as focused on results and outcomes as we do. This means a lot more transparency. Government departments define themselves by the information they control. That's coming to an end pretty rapidly because 2 people with an iPad can understand all the demographics and target quite small segments of the population of Sydney. We don't need government departments to do that anymore. And that will lead to more and more transparency. If you have time this week, we publish all the performance reviews of our government departments on the State Services Commission website. And the latest one that's just gone up is of our Justice Ministry, who run our courts, which have historically been a shambles. They don't run well, they have been quite disorganised, and we're going through a top-to-bottom reform of our court system. And the performance review is very gritty. And 3 or 4 years ago, it would have been buried deep in a shredder in a government department. But now we're creating a culture of transparency and honesty, and it's out there. I invite you to go and read it. What all this amounts to is a better solution-seeking process. And of course, it doesn't apply just to social spending, although that's a very large part of government fiscal pressure. It also applies to infrastructure, where the combined private sector, public sector governance models you have in Australia is well ahead of where we are, and we copy it as quickly and as accurately as we can, because it certainly fits our framework. A better solution-seeking process also applies to regulation. We're being lawyered to death by complexity in regulation. We need to move to much more of a co-production model with our regulated industries, backed up by enforcement, of course, to cut through that complexity. And with our social spending, we simply don't know the answers to a lot of the social problems the public think that we are solving, and we need to create the learning loops that enable the public service to keep learning. It struck me coming back into government in 2008, after 9 years out, how similar the conversations were to 10 or 15 years before. How do we collaborate? Well, collaboration is a word I banned from my office. It means we have lots of meetings and no one's responsible. What we want is impact. What did you do that made a difference? Because every week you take longer to fix that problem out in that community is costing us the cost of failure and the misery in that community. So we're looking forward to continuing to do what we do, which is treat Australian public services as our little experiment laboratory. So the states all do it a bit differently, and they all have great ideas, and we enjoy a very open relationship, and we copy everything we can. We're starting to build, I think, after 5 or 6 years, some real momentum about change in our public service in New Zealand. And I would imagine in 3 or 4 years it will be virtually unrecognisable from what it was in 2008. Thank you.